Thanks for having me, and thanks for everyone coming. And thanks to Alana and JD, who are the director and assistant director for National Academy of Science and this program, and allowing me to be here, which is a huge honor, and it's an amazing building, and so thank you for that. And they run this program within National Academy of Science, the cultural program, which is how I end up happening to be here. And that is, the idea of that is to bring together scientists and artists and have them benefit from each other. And certainly I think scientists can benefit from artists, and artists can certainly benefit from being around scientists. So I made this body of work that is a combination of the two. It's art and science, and so that's how I ended up right here at the intersection of the avenue of science and art. This is where we are. So the show is sort of three different series. There's this one here, which is about the telescope itself. There's this set down here, which is about one of the things the astronomers want to use the telescope for. And then there are these two here, which are sort of about quantum physics, which is a little bit difficult. So I think I'll start with the science part, because that's a lot easier than talking about art. So I don't know how many people know about the telescope. I'll just give a quick rundown. It's a space telescope that's been designed to replace the Hubble Space Telescope. The Hubble Space Telescope is going to burn up in a couple years. So they've been planning and building this thing for 20 years, and it's 15 years over time and $9 billion over budget. It's just the most cutting edge thing that they've ever made. It's so tricky that they didn't even know how to build it when they first designed it. They had to invent a whole lot of things to do it. So I was one of several artists that NASA selected to come out to Goddard, where they assembled this telescope, to make artwork about the telescope, the purpose being to publicize it, and because it's public money and they want the public to know about it, and they thought, well, get artists to spread the word, and the more people that know about it, the harder it is for Congress to cut their budget. So that's what they're always worried about. So that's how I got involved, and so I got a behind the scenes tour of the telescope a couple times, and it just was fascinating to me, and it was super inspirational. So I was able to get up close, and I took a lot of photographs, and from those photographs I have come up with this body of work. So not all the photographs are mine, because I didn't have that much access to the telescope. It's in a clean room, and so you have to shoot through a window, and there's some top secret stuff on there, so it's very limited, the access. So they also have a NASA official photographer who has taken some great photographs, and I based those three drawings on his photographs. Now they're open source and license free and so forth, but not that that matters because I'm reinterpreting them. But those are from him. His name is Gunn, who's a fantastic photographer. But I took the other photographs that the drawings are based on. So the art part. So these drawings they're kind of an exploration of the relationship between photography, sculpture, and abstraction. So they're drawn as close as I can make to the photographs, more or less. So they're sort of photorealistic drawings. In my past life, I've done a lot of sculpture and a lot of photography, and so I'm always drawn to the sculptural elements of things that I'm looking at, and my photographs try to sort of emphasize that. One of the reasons I work in the square format is it's not landscape and it's not portrait, and it's something else, and it's something unique, just like the object itself. Is sort of, I think it helps to take it out of the realm of the scene, like a landscape is a scene, and more into the realm of an object. And so I try to do that. I'm a black and white photographer. That's what I'm drawn to, even though these have got a lot of color in them, but they really only have like one color in them. Because I treat color more like an object. I don't really, I don't think in color, and so when I have color in there, it's just sort of like a thing in and of itself. So the telescope, I'll tell you a little bit about it. So it's gold-plated, and that's because it's an infrared telescope instead of an optical telescope. It's and gold reflects infrared better than silver does. So that's why they made it gold. And when you're describing gold, well, there's no such color as gold. Gold is only gold because it's reflecting its environment. What you think of as gold is actually the reflections of this yellowish. So to describe this mirror, you have to describe the reflections. And this is why I took this photograph, because what I liked about it was the reflections of the ceiling and the room. It's a clean room. It's a very specialized room, but it's a boring, crappy old room with I-beams and bad fluorescent light and But I love that idea. I love the construction. I love the industrial design, not only of the telescope but of the building and the I-beams and the nuts and the bolts and the railing. And I love that juxtaposition of this very mundane with the very exquisite. That's not what this telescope is for. It's not for imaging nuts and bolts. It's for imaging the infinite. And so it's kind of a contradiction right there. And it's this juxtaposition of the very mundane, the sort of the nitty-gritty, the sort of the infrastructure with this incredibly precise tool. And drawing it in charcoal and pastel also is a kind of a contradiction, because those are very primitive tools. That's sort of the first artistic medium of mankind 50,000 years ago. This is what they were using. And here I am using it to describe something that's of unbelievable precision. So that was kind of a challenge, but I think that adds a lot to it, sort of the warmth, and makes it sort of more handmade feeling in a way, which the telescope is. I mean, it's made with machines, but there are people running them, and sort of brings a little more humanity into it. One of the questions is, why draw it? I took this photograph. It was a good photograph. I liked it. But I don't know if it was good enough. Now, every artist has got their self-doubts. And being a photographer in this day and age, starting about 10 years ago, I just had more and more doubts about photography, my photography in particular. There's a very good photographer downstairs. He does something different. He's very successful, and I applaud him. But for me, photography was becoming less valuable to me, in that everyone's got a fantastic camera in their pocket. With no training, with no effort whatsoever, you can take a great picture. You can go to Walmart and get a picture printed like this for $100. It's super easy. And just that fact alone just gave me more doubt in my own work. So I started drawing my photographs. So in effect, I'm kind of the printer. And because once you put something on paper, it's like, oh, he's a genius. He's an artist. He made a mark. Whereas a photography, everyone can do it. Is it that special? I don't know. So that was creeping into my work. But even if you try as hard as you can, and I've tried very hard with this drawing to make it as photographic as possible, there's always an element of streamlining and simplification, which, even if you're not trying to do that, you can't help but do that. It amplifies you can say emotional content, but certainly the compositional content, and it just, if you can breathe life into it, that's, I think, a plus, and it brings more to it. And then the other question is, why charcoal and pastel? Why not pencil? Anyone who had any sense would use pencil, because you can control a pencil. It's very hard to control charcoal. I don't have a lot of sense. So I'm a black and white photographer. I love the tonality you can get, the gradient, tones and of black and white photography. So if you take charcoal and you make a big blotch of it, and you take your thumb and smear it, you know what you're going to get. You're going to get a gradient tone from black to medium gray to light gray. And those tones are very similar to black and white photography. And that's what really attracts me. It's very seductive, and that's why I sort of gravitated towards that. Whereas a pencil, you can do it with pencil, but it's against its nature. Pencil designed to make lines. I'm more interested in tones. So the problem is, how do you control the charcoal? So I've developed a lot of ways to do it and use masks and paper things and a bunch of tools. And so I've been able to tame charcoal, and and in that way I've been able to keep what I really love about it, which is sort of black and white tone part of it. And then there's another interesting thing. I was asking a friend of mine who's a very good photographer, and he's done some paintings which are sort of photorealistic. And I asked him the same question. I was like, why'd you paint it? Your photographs are great. What's wrong with that? And he said, well, it's about dedication. And so I thought about that, and I thought, oh, that's true. That these take me like a month and a half, sometimes 2 months to draw. So when I'm choosing the image, I work on the computer like a lot of photographers, and I compose it and I think about it. But knowing how much time it's going to take really focuses your attention into, is this the best image? Is this cropped the right way? What else can I do with it? Can I clean it up a little bit? Is that piece of garbage in the corner? Maybe I'll take that out. It really forces you to dedicate your thought and time and energy into that image, and hopefully be able to defend it. Like, why this? Why did I drag you here? You got better things to do in life, and come down here. Is this worth your time? So you try and, so spending that much time on it, it does impart a lot of value to it, I think. I mean, it's not just wasting time, which sometimes it feels like, but I think in the end, you get something out of it that you can't get in photography. And so these two drawings on the side, they're not the telescope itself, but these are tools that they use to build the telescope. So this is next door to where this was sitting, 50 feet away. And this is the acoustic test chamber. After they built this, they had to test it. So they know this is going to be launched on the Ariane 5 rocket. And they know all the vibrations that rocket is going to impart on this telescope during the launch. And so they built a table that moves three-dimensionally. And it took them 2 years just to build this table. And they put the telescope on it and they shake it, and every one of these frequencies that the rocket will impart on it. And then they hope to break it here, not there, because there's no fixing it once it goes out there. But that only went up to a certain frequency. Then above that frequency, they put it in this room. So this is a speaker, and they blast it with sonic waves at a higher frequency for 3 days and see if they could break it there. And so it's just a tool that they use to help test this telescope. But I liked it because of just sort of the simple geometry. I liked it because of these thrusting lines. It has a lot of classical features to it. It has like this false perspective. It sort of reminds me of like a Renaissance Raphael painting, and it has this sort of interesting geometry. And then by putting in a few details, you sort of bring it to life. So that's where the photography part comes in. So it's this combination of my interest in sort of geometry and architecture, industrial design, plus photography, which involves the tones, and like black and white photography particularly, the tones of black and white photography, and the sort of accuracy of photography too. So, I could have just cleaned the whole thing up and done some circles and some lines, but, I added all the little details and the wires and the acoustic microphones, and so it's this odd mix of all these things. And this is sort of building on the tradition. There's an American art movement called the Precisionism. It sort of came about in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, sort of followed on from another movement called constructivism. And that's where they were, sort of the machine age was a new thing, turn of the century. Industrialization had really kicked into gear, and things were being streamlined, and that was inspirational to a lot of people. It sort of spawned the Art Deco movement and all that, but it spawned this movement called Precisionism. Charles Sheeler is one of the most famous artists from that period, and they were after in a way, glorifying industrial architecture and geometry and sort of streamlining and cleaning up things in the built environment that people don't really think about too much. You see an ugly factory, and it's just an ugly factory, but they would paint it in a way that sort of made it sort of heroic. And that's, I'm not so much inspired by them, but I'm inspired by the same things that inspired them. So that's sort of where these sort of come from. And this is a similar idea. This is part of this cryogenic testing chamber. This is just a sort of cage they put the, whatever it is, the telescope in, and then they'd lower that into the cryogenic testing chamber. This is not something that Goddard shows you. No one has any interest in this thing. It's just a circular I-beam thing. But I liked it because of its sort of pure geometry and these simplified forms. Like the constructivists have that same idea of, like, simplifying and glorifying architecture and very primitive shapes. So I just saw this, and I saw this really simple primitive shape, and I could have made this line a perfect curve, but instead I made it what it was. This is just a piece of tape that's been put on by hand, and it's sort of crooked, but that's exactly the way it was made. So it's this sort of the combination of the accuracy of photography and the perfection of geometry. And so you sort of have these simplified shapes, but then again, I included an ugly piece of ductwork. These three drawings are from photographs that the official NASA photographer took. His name is Gunn. I only had limited access to the telescope, so I found these online on the NASA web page, and they're all license free and all that, but I modified them a lot. So I used some of his photographs for my basis for these drawings. This is the primary mirror, and it's reflecting the secondary mirror, which is out here, which is reflecting the primary mirror again. So this is the secondary mirror, and in its reflection, sits out here, is the primary mirror again. So this thing here is this thing here. And then, like, this boom is the same as that boom. So it's a neat optical play. And I liked it because of this simplified geometry. And I cropped it in ways that sort of cleaned it up. And I took out a lot of sort of test equipment that was in there. After they more or less assembled it at Goddard, they put it on an airplane, gave it a first-class ticket, and sent it to Houston, where they put it in the world's largest cryogenic vacuum testing chamber that was built for the Apollo space program. It's where they tested the lunar landers and the command modules. So they were able to have it deployed fully open and bring it down to temperature, which is minus 400 degrees, and down to a low vacuum. And then they put some artificial lights in the chamber to see does it work? Did anything break? When it's that cold, things shrink and all kinds of things can happen. So they just wanted to see, does the light go in the sensor? Does it go down the hose? Does it come out in the bucket? Does it sort of semi-function at this temperature and pressure? So it took them 3 months. It took them a month to get it down to temperature and pressure, and another month at pressure, and then a month to bring it out of pressure. And then I used this photograph, but I put it into Photoshop, where I do my work in photography, and I added a filter to it that sort of amplified made a weird effect on the lights that sort of made them more star-like, more spiky and sort of alien in a way, foreign and mysterious. So made it a little bit more abstract. But again, keeping the photographic elements, you can see in the reflection part of the test equipment that's on the ceiling. And these panels, they're made out of beryllium, which is like titanium. They use beryllium because it's more thermally stable than titanium. So each of these panels weighed like 400 pounds. It's like 3 inches thick. And then they milled out the back. They milled out like 94% of the material into a convoluted triangular pattern on the back. So these panels only weigh like 40 pounds. And then they spent 3.5 years polishing them. That's how shiny those things are. And then they gold-plated them. But they ground them to a curve. You don't want to make the same mistake that Hubble had. So they ground them to this shape, very precise shape, but it actually was, they didn't grind it to the correct shape. They grind it to the incorrect shape, because when you put it at minus 400 degrees, it warps, it curls, and it has to curl to the correct shape. So when these are ground, they're ground at ambient temperature, like whatever the factory is, like 70 degrees. And so they have to grind it incorrectly and then hope the math is right. So when they put it under temperature, it warps to the exact shape. Now, if it ends up being 399 degrees or 401 degrees out there, that will change the shape too. But fortunately, each of these mirrors has got 7 actuators where they can bend it and twist it, and so they can refocus it later and fix any problems in theory up to a point. So that's just one of the million super tricky things about this telescope. So then we can go down here, I guess. Next stop on the tour. So one of the things that they're interested in, the astronomers are interested in, is what is they want to know, a certain group of astronomers, they want to know what's at the center of our galaxy. So they are very excited to use this telescope to look at that. But in the meantime, they've been spending last 10 years using the telescope in the Atacama Desert, the European Southern Observatory, the VLT, and the Keck Observatory in Hawaii. And they've been tracking these stars. And it's very hard to image this because it's 26,000 light years away, which is pretty far, but it's in the plane of the disk of the galaxy. So you're looking through a whole lot of crap to see this area. And infrared can see through dust much better than optical. So that's why they're excited to do that. But nevertheless, they've been trying their best. And they invented some way of imaging this, but the woman who invented it, she actually got the Nobel Prize for that, and they made this model. So they're using this data. They tracked these stars for 10 years, and they made a 3D model, which I came across, and I just thought it was really a neat visual thing, and I was attracted to it for those reasons. And sort of learned more about it. And so these they're kind of maps in a way. And it's of our galaxy. And being a map, it's a very Renaissance thing. That quest for knowledge, that quest for understanding of place, and the importance that people, particularly starting in the Renaissance era, which is probably not true, probably before that too, but they get all the credit for it. That was one of the fundamental things that they were really interested in. And so if you know the orbital period of the star, like how long it takes to go around, and you know the shape, then you know the mass of the thing at the center that balances the equation, so that this doesn't go flying off or go crashing in. So these are more or less balanced. So when you add up all these stars and all these elliptical shapes, you can come to the conclusion that there's something in the middle here that is 4 million times the mass of our sun. And then by a matter of deduction, you can just say, well, it's a black hole. So then they know that the center of our galaxy is a black hole. And what I've done is, they don't look, these drawings, they look very different than those, but in a way, it's the same treatment I've given it. They're drawn as accurately as I can, as accurately as I try to draw those drawings of the model that they had created based on that data. So these are, in a way, photographic, like those are. And I tried my best to describe these elliptical shapes accurately, and that was important to me because I love the science. But this sense of place, it's a fundamental thing for mankind, for eternity. People want to know fundamentally where they are. Like I live in a house across the street, 5 miles from the river, 260 miles from Andy, and 26,000 light years from that. So people want to know these landmark things, and it's so important that when people thought the Earth was the center of the universe, and then someone comes along and says, well, I think it's the sun, it's so important that they throw them in jail, because it means something. It's because power and religion, it's based on that sense of place. If you're the center of the universe, that imbues you with power, just automatically. And if someone says, well, you're not, that's just immediately stripping you of that power. So, I wasn't thinking about that when I first started drawing these, but again, as you take time and mull all over these things, it's like, why? You got to be able to answer, like, why this? Why are the astronomers interested in this? There's a billion things to look at in the universe. Why this spot? And so I thought, well, that's just a fundamental thing. So that's all I got to say about that. Anyway, yes.
What are the colors? Can you explain the color difference?
It's just random. Well, this one in the middle that's red, this star is the one that goes closest, and being in a very elliptical shape, as it comes close to the black hole, it whips around. And, Johann Kepler, he figured this out in 1620, I think. It's unbelievable. So being able to describe how an elliptical shape works, it was Isaac Newton who kind of came up with the gravitational forces that balance it. But it goes like slowly, and then it goes, whips around as it gets closer, and then slows down. So it goes at such a velocity, it's going so close to the black hole that the light redshifts because it distorts time and space. And so they were anxious to see that. I think the orbital period of this is 9 years. So they were waiting for it to go by, and they were saying, okay, they theoretically anticipated that it would shift to the red a certain amount. They saw that, and that was further proof of Einstein's theory of special relativity, which he predicted. This is one of the effects of that. And so they saw that, and that's why I made that one red. So it reminded me of that.
How do you draw such perfect ellipses?
I use a string and pins.
Okay.
So I use that, and that's if you use 2 pins at the foci, then when you know the width and the length, you make your string the exact length, and then you will get the exact elliptical shape.
So those are pins.
All right, now we'll go down. We'll go to this one down here. So a telescope, like your eye, like anything that images things, your eye sees things at some distance. The light bounces off the object, scatters, and eventually reaches your eye. But so what you see is not what was emitted from that object at that instant. What you see is, depending on the distance, some time ago. So when you look at the sun, you see the light from 8 minutes ago. You don't see it as it was today. So the further out you can look, the more powerful your telescope, the more this effect is obvious. So this telescope is designed to look pretty close to the edge of the visible universe, which is 13.5 or 9 billion light years away. And it's the light that was emitted from those objects out there, those distant galaxies, by the time it hits the telescope and the sensor, it has taken 13.5 billion years to reach there. So what you're seeing is actually something that has occurred 13 billion years ago. So in a way, a telescope or anything like that is a time machine. You're able to look back in time. And astronomers use that. So if they see a star that's over here and they see another star that's similar that's over here, you can say the star looked like this a billion years ago, and it looks like this half a billion years ago. So they can like roll back the clock and see how the universe unfolded. So a telescope is kind of like a time machine. This thing here is a reproduction print of a drawing like this, which I don't have in the show here. And then I copied it, printed it, and then on top of it I drew this wiggly line. And then that one has a different wiggly line. So when I took the photograph that I based the drawing on, I was attracted to this shape that part of the mirrors is this bow tie shape. And I composed the picture for that reason because it reminded me in the back of my mind of this thing called a Feynman diagram, which is what this thing is, and which is a diagram that describes quantum electrodynamics. Now, I know everyone knows all about that already, but I'll just go over it a little bit. So I liked the formal aspect of it, and I liked that it reminded me of this thing. So I thought about it for 4 years, and I finally got up the courage to to do this thing right on top of it. And that's the way I came to it. So the reason I did that was, A, that it has a similar bow tie shape. That's what originally attracted me to it. And I love the formal aspect of the geometry of that. And then B, it has an element of time, like a different element of time in it than the telescope. So the telescope is like the macro view. That's like the universal view of time. And this final diagram is describing the quantum, the micro. And the way this drawing works is there's time, it's a scale. You got time and you got space. So you got an electron, it's going along through space and time, and then it can spontaneously emit a photon. And then there's a reaction and the vector deviates off, and then this electron comes along here, and then it can absorb that photon, and then the mass forces add up and the vector goes off that way. That's all well and good. And that's describing, this is how light scatters. And so everything you see is light scattering off of some object. It's bouncing off of this and it hits your eye. So this is the fundamental way the light scatters. So, and everything you see, I'm a visual person, is based on that. This is what you look at a drawing, and that's your eyes making sense of this light scattering. So this is at the tiniest level of particle size. But the problem in this drawing is that, in this diagram, is that this wiggly line is going downhill. And so that means that it's going backward in time. So it means that it's emitting this photon, and then at some point earlier in time, it's absorbing it. So either time goes backwards, or, which we don't really think is true, but we don't really know, or there's other ways to look at this. But you can say that this is an electron, this is a positron, and they annihilate each other and a photon comes out. That's one way. Or you could talk about it in terms of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, where you actually don't know where they are at any time. You can either know the momentum or you can know the position, but you can't know both, so it could actually be that. You don't really know that for sure either, because this is the quantum. But it's just another way of thinking about time. The time is malleable, and it's related to space. And so putting these two, the macro together with the micro, I just thought it was an interesting idea. And so that's what these two drawings are about, this mashup of these two ideas of space-time. But you already knew that, so. You got a question? You look quizzical. Yeah, so it was mostly assembled at Goddard, NASA Goddard here in Beltsville. And then they put it on a plane and they flew it to Houston, Texas, where they put it in the cryogenic testing chamber. And then they flew it to California, to Redondo Beach, where the surf's up, and to Northrop Grumman, who has been constructing the sun shield. So, like a regular film camera, let's say, the image that you produce from a camera is the difference between light and dark. So a camera has to be dark because the image is the addition of light to the film or the sensor. So this is an infrared telescope, so the image is actually, it's imaging heat. So the image is actually the difference between hot and cold. So the camera and everything else has to be cold because the image is the difference between that and heat. So they have to have this sunshade, which is the size of, it's bigger than this room. And of course, none of this fits in the rocket. So this mirror doesn't fit in the rocket. It has to fold. This sunshade is made out of wafer-thin Mylar type material. It has to fold like origami. It's not even one tennis court. It's actually 5 tennis courts stacked up because it blocks, the first layer blocks 99% of the sun's radiant energy. Well, that's not good enough. So the 1% that goes through, the next layer blocks 99% of that 1%, but that's not good enough. They have to have 5 layers. And so Northrop Grumman assembled this sun shield, which was very tricky, and they had problems with it from the beginning, and then they finally had it. This was supposed to launch like 10 years ago. And like a year and a half ago, they tested the sunshade, and it ripped. When they unfurled it, and they had to redesign the whole thing again. And anyway, and then problem solved. They loaded it on a barge and dragged it to French Guiana where they're going to launch it. They're going through the Panama Canal, and they got to the French Guiana. This is like 2-3 weeks ago. It's there. They got it off the barge, didn't break, no hurricanes hit it, no pirates, took it for ransom. It's in French Guiana. They use French Guiana site because that's the European Space Agency's place where they launch from. And it's advantageous because the rotation of the Earth, the closer you are to the equator, you get the rotational energy of the Earth to propel your rocket further. So you can either use less fuel, carry a heavier payload, or send it further out into space. And since this is sort of maxing out the payload, they wanted to get every boost they could. So they chose French Guiana for that reason, plus that's where the Europeans launched from. And they're using a French rocket to launch it because the time this was designed, that was the biggest, safest rocket in existence, the best track record. And so they have given NASA the ride. So they got the free ride, and then the Europeans also developed 2 of the cameras, a spectrographic camera and an infrared camera that are in that baffle thing there. So that's what they've contributed to the project. Canada's contributed something to the project too, another camera. I forget how many things have to, like actuators, like 150 steps that have to take place to unfold this thing and get into operation. And if any one of those fails, it's just trouble. And it's, the temperature is so cold. And
So how much is sort of scientific knowledge or technology contribute to your creation of these works?
Well, that's, I'm drawn to that. I like that kind of stuff. And then spending this much time, when I can only draw so many hours a day, and when I'm not doing it, I think about it. Like when you're drawing a thing like this, it's like, what is that for? And why is this wrinkled? And, you got a lot of time to think while you're drawing it. And then, I go on the Google machine and you start reading about things, and that's how I came across that. Reading about this, and then it's like you chase links down the road, and then you find other things. But
could you do it just by looking at the photograph and not doing Googling?
Yeah, anyone could. You could draw this too if you want.
What does that?
I'll show you how. Yeah, I'll show you how. I got a piece of charcoal. I got an extra one.
Okay.
Yeah, you can do it. But yeah, you have to have the enthusiasm to want to draw it, and knowing all this science about it is, I'm enthusiastic about it. And I don't know if that answers your question.
You obviously know a lot about the science.
I didn't know one thing about it until I didn't even know this thing existed until I saw this call for artists. I'm like, what is this thing? Like, this sounds interesting.
Okay, so what happens after it launches?
So, okay, they're going to launch it December 18th. Then it takes a month to get out there. So the Hubble telescope is in the Earth's orbit, 350 miles up. But that's no good for an infrared telescope because the Earth radiates a lot of energy, a lot of heat. It bounces off the sun, bounces off the Earth from the sun. So they got to put it way out there. So they're going to put it in this special orbit 1 million miles from Earth. The moon is 250,000 miles, so it's 4 times the distance of the moon. It's way out there. Now, normally, the further out you go, like if you got the sun in the middle and you got planets going around, and they go around at a certain orbital period, certain frequency. So the Earth goes around the sun every 365 days, and then Mars goes around a little slower. So the further out you go, the slower the orbital period is, or the longer the period, to balance the equation. If it was going faster, it would just fly off into space, and if it went slower, it would crash into the sun. So the further out you go, the slower the orbit is, and Mars, if they line up the sun, Earth, Mars, eventually it drags behind as you go around the sun. And so if you put the telescope further out from the sun, it'll drag behind too, which is no good, because eventually it'll be on the other side of the sun, and you don't have telemetry, and it's just, it's pretty far away, and that's no good. But there's a special orbit out there called Lagrange point 2, where if you add up the mass of the sun and the Earth and combine them, there's a point out there which is a super stable point where it's paired with the Earth, and it'll go around the sun together paired with the Earth. So it doesn't lose telemetry and doesn't get far away from the Earth. So that's where they're going to park it, in this spot called the L2 Lagrange point 2 spot. They have one telescope out there already, and then they put it out there, which is super tricky. So it takes a month to get out there. And on the way, they start unfolding and they do a bunch of steps. But it'll take about another 6 months for them to get it operational, aim the mirrors, unfold everything, bring it down to temperature. The camera in there, which is the thermal camera, it's minus 400 degrees. That's not even cold enough. They actually have a chiller on the thing. There's actually a refrigerator to get it even colder. And then they have to have a radiator to radiate the heat for that camera. I mean, the whole thing is just so crazy. It just goes on and on like that. You could talk for hours about. So anyway, that's where they're going to park it, and it will be out there. The mission's length is supposed to be designed for 5 years, but if the rocket inserts it into the orbit correctly, and they don't have to use much propellant to get them to station, then it could last 10 years. But if the rocket doesn't propel them correctly and they got to use a lot of energy, then hopefully it will last 5 years.
I have a question. Over the years, we've seen, many of us here, I think, have seen your work kind of grow. And a lot of your earlier work tended to be about decay, rust, like, things that are old and getting older. Now the shift is things that are new and getting newer. So the technology has really shifted in terms of like how you render them and what your palettes look like. So it's a very different look, but yet you still like to use the, as you put, like the kind of more primitive techniques to juxtapose the new objects you're rendering, against the older techniques of how you're actually putting it. Where are you going with that? And why is that a new direction for you?
What you want to know is what's wrong with me. Well, actually, I think it's not a new direction. When I started drawing this, I didn't know what I was doing. You draw one, it's like, oh, and you draw another, and it's like, okay. And then after a while, you see, okay, well, what's the commonality here? That it sort of comes to you as you go. And if you're true to yourself, then what's really you comes out in it. And what I'm interested in these is actually, I think, quite similar to my older work. Like, they got the I-beams and that. I used to make these. My previous series was about old industrial machines, and I would go up to Baltimore and photograph them, and they were rusty and the paint's peeling. But it was actually a very similar idea to this. It was, at one point when these machines were made or useful or invented, someone took great pride in them. They were precision things. They were super useful, and you add a lot of time, and the world goes forward. And they, became obsolete, and there's just sort of, now they're garbage in a way, but, they still have this inherent beauty, and there's an awful lot of pride that's sort of buried underneath the dirt and grime. So I always sort of considered those older ones of these old machines sort of like these, the juxtaposition of sort of the exquisite and the mundane, like the everyday or the deteriorated and the precise. And so that's what I like about these, like having the ductwork in there is sort of very mundane, yet this has to do with a cryogenic testing chamber, or they got this polished mirror with these I-beams and nuts and bolts. And so, and like this, you got some messy wires, but it's like this super sophisticated, very precise tool for this one particular type of test. But it's, the room is not painted well, and the paint's flaking there too. So I think it's similar to those older drawings. I didn't know that when I started. I wasn't intending to do that. It just, if you're true to yourself, it just comes out.
You look great. That was awesome.
All right, that's
Thank you.
all I got to say.